The Second World War ended with two flashes of light that changed human history forever. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first and only time nuclear weapons were used in war. In those moments, humanity stepped into a new era, one where survival depended on fear itself. After the surrender of Japan, the United States became the world's first and only nuclear power. The bomb had ended a global conflict, but it also opened a door that could never be closed. Inside the laboratories of Los Alamos and the hangars of the U.S. Air Force, engineers and officers were already preparing for the next war, a war that might never be fought, yet could destroy the planet in a single night. By 1947, the U.S. military had begun assembling an arsenal of atomic weapons. These bombs weren't stored in silos or bunkers. They were loaded onto aircraft, ready to fly at a moment's notice. Each flight was a mission of deterrence, but every mission carried a silent danger. A single spark, a damaged wire, or a human mistake could trigger the unthinkable. In those early years, nuclear weapons weren't as stable as the public imagined. They were hand-assembled by technicians under pressure, often in the field, with no standardized safety procedures. Every weapon was unique, each one relying on mechanical parts and electrical circuits that could fail without warning. And yet, they were flown across continents, every day, over cities, oceans, and allied territories. It was a time of paranoia. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, ending America's monopoly. The Cold War had begun. The Pentagon responded with a new strategy: keep bombers in the air 24 hours a day, armed and ready to strike. This operation was known as Chrome Dome. Dozens of B-52s circled the globe constantly, each carrying live nuclear warheads powerful enough to destroy entire nations. But constant readiness meant constant risk. Every pilot, every engineer, every mechanic understood that one technical failure could mean the end of the world. The aircraft were old, the equipment was experimental, and the weather was unpredictable. The odds of something going wrong grew higher with every mission. Inside the Strategic Air Command, the men who flew these bombers lived in silence. They were told their mission was to preserve peace, that their presence in the sky prevented nuclear war. But many of them knew the truth. The greater threat wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes it was the weapon they carried themselves. The first serious accident occurred in February 1950. A B-36 bomber, carrying a Mark IV atomic bomb, took off from Alaska for a simulated combat mission. Hours later, its engines failed in bad weather. The crew jettisoned the weapon over the Pacific before abandoning the aircraft. The bomb was never recovered. The U.S. government claimed it contained no nuclear core. It did. That incident was classified as the first broken arrow, the military code for a serious accident involving a nuclear weapon. It would not be the last. Over the next 4 decades, there would be 32 of them. Bombs lost in oceans. Bombs that broke apart on American soil. Bombs that nearly detonated. Each time, the public was told nothing. The official reports used neutral phrases: training mission failure, fuel system malfunction. No nuclear materials involved, but behind those words were near catastrophes that could have changed history. By the mid-1950s, the nuclear arsenal had grown beyond control. The United States now had hundreds of warheads scattered across bases in the Pacific, Europe, and North America. Many were stored in unsafe conditions, guarded by airmen barely trained in handling them. The physicists who had built the first bombs watched this expansion with horror. Robert Oppenheimer, once celebrated as the father of the atomic bomb, warned that mankind was on a path of self-destruction. "We have done the work of the devil," he said, and he was right. The technology advanced faster than the safety. Hydrogen bombs replaced atomic ones, 1,000 times more powerful and infinitely more dangerous. The United States and the Soviet Union raced to outbuild each other, testing devices in the atmosphere, under the ocean, and in the desert. Each test released clouds of radioactive fallout that drifted across the planet. But the most dangerous moments weren't in the test sites. They were in the skies, when armed aircraft patrolled with bombs that could detonate by accident. During the height of the Cold War, America's nuclear pilots carried with them the weight of the world. They flew missions, knowing that one malfunction, one crash, could erase everything they were sworn to protect. And yet, they kept flying. Because in their minds, keeping those weapons ready was the only way to prevent the Soviets from ever using theirs. It was a strategy built on fear and on faith that nothing would go wrong. But things did go wrong. In the coming years, the United States would lose control of its own nuclear weapons, again and again, sometimes over its own territory, sometimes over its allies. And each time, disaster came closer than anyone would admit. The world remembers Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the beginning of nuclear warfare. But few remember the nights when nuclear war almost returned by accident. And one of those nights happened over a quiet farm field in North Carolina. On the night of January 24, 1961, a B-52 Stratofortress took off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. Its mission was routine, part of the United States Constant Airborne Nuclear Alert Program known as Chrome Dome. The bomber carried to Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs, each one more than 250 times as powerful as the weapon dropped on Hiroshima. At 12:30 a.m., while cruising over the quiet countryside near Goldsboro, the aircraft began leaking fuel from its right wing. The crew had seen it before. Maintenance crews often patched these bombers quickly to keep them in the air. The pilot, Major Walter Tulloch, reported the issue and was ordered to return to base. But before he could descend, the situation turned catastrophic. The right wing suddenly failed. The bomber rolled sharply, began to disintegrate, and within seconds, it broke apart completely. 6 of the 8 crew members managed to eject. 2 never came home. As the aircraft fell, its deadly cargo separated from the fuselage. 2 live hydrogen bombs, armed with high explosive triggers and full nuclear cores, began their descent toward rural North Carolina. The first bomb's parachute deployed successfully, slowing its fall. It drifted silently through the night sky before coming to rest in a muddy field, its bright green casing half buried in the earth. The second bomb hit hard near a swamp and disappeared beneath the ground. When the recovery teams arrived, they expected a simple cleanup. What they found instead terrified them. The first bomb's arming sequence had advanced almost completely. Of the 4 safety mechanisms designed to prevent a nuclear detonation, 3 had failed. The only thing that stopped a multi-megaton explosion on American soil was a single low-voltage safety switch worth less than $1. Had that small electrical component failed, the explosion would have vaporized everything within a 15-mile radius. Raleigh, Goldsboro, and even parts of Washington, D.C. could have been exposed to radioactive fallout. Millions of Americans might have died within hours, all because of a broken aircraft and a cheap safety switch. The Pentagon immediately classified the incident. The official report stated that there was no danger of a nuclear detonation. But years later, when the documents were declassified, the truth emerged. Nuclear safety engineer Parker F. Jones reviewed the Goldsboro incident in 1969 and wrote a confidential memorandum titled Goldsboro Revisited. His conclusion was stark. One simple, low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe. He ended the report with a chilling sentence. The bomb did not possess adequate safety to prevent a nuclear detonation. The remains of one bomb were removed and dismantled under strict supervision. The other, buried deep in the swamp, was never fully recovered. Its uranium components remain underground to this day, sealed beneath layers of earth and concrete near Faro, North Carolina. The public never knew how close they had come to nuclear annihilation. Local newspapers reported a plane crash. The truth that 2 hydrogen bombs had fallen from the sky and nearly detonated stayed secret for decades. Inside the Pentagon, the Goldsboro incident triggered panic. Senior officials ordered an immediate review of nuclear weapon safety. What they discovered was worse than anyone had expected. At that time, most American bombs had no coded locks or true mechanical failsafes. Arming a weapon required only the right combination of electrical signals and human error. This event, more than any other, forced the U.S. military to begin designing a new safety philosophy, one that came to be known as always, never. A nuclear weapon must always detonate when ordered, and never detonate by accident. But in 1961, that was still theory. The world had simply been lucky. In the years that followed, engineers quietly upgraded every weapon in the arsenal, adding multiple redundant systems and coded locks. But they did it in silence, because admitting the truth would have meant acknowledging that for nearly 2 decades, the United States had flown nuclear bombs that could have exploded from a single short circuit. Goldsboro remains one of the closest near misses in nuclear history, a moment when a single $1 switch decided the fate of millions. It was January 17, 1966. The Cold War had reached its most dangerous balance, peace by fear, maintained by machines in the sky. Over the Mediterranean, a B-52 bomber from the United States Air Force was returning from a long patrol. On board were 4 hydrogen bombs, each 20 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The flight was routine. The mission code name was Hardhead 6. The bomber needed refueling before returning to its base in North Carolina. High above the coast of southern Spain, at 31,000 feet, a KC-135 tanker approached. The 2 aircraft connected for the in-flight refueling, a maneuver so delicate that even a few centimeters of error could turn fatal. At 10:22 a.m., disaster struck. The bomber came in too fast. The refueling boom tore through its fuselage, and both planes exploded in midair. A fireball lit up the clear Spanish sky, scattering burning debris and radioactive weapons across the countryside. 7 airmen died instantly. The wreckage rained down near the small fishing village of Palomares. Population 2,000. Witnesses described the sky raining fire and metal. They didn't know that some of the falling objects carried the power to erase their entire village. 4 hydrogen bombs fell that day. One landed safely with its parachute deployed. Another dropped into a dry riverbed. The third hit a hillside and exploded, not its nuclear core, but its conventional trigger, scattering plutonium dust across farmland. The fourth disappeared into the sea. Within hours, Spanish farmers began to notice strange, heavy debris in their fields. A few men touched the metallic fragments, unaware that they were covered in radioactive dust. The U.S. military sealed the area and launched an emergency recovery operation, codenamed Broken Arrow, Palomares. More than 1,400 American troops arrived within days, setting up decontamination camps and using Geiger counters that screamed in every direction. The Spanish government, then under Francisco Franco's dictatorship, immediately ordered silence. The regime depended on American military aid and did not want to risk the alliance. Publicly, both governments said the situation was under control. Privately, panic spread. 2 of the bombs had ruptured and contaminated roughly 2 square kilometers of farmland with plutonium, one of the most toxic substances known to man. Even a few micrograms inhaled can cause cancer. But there was something worse. 1 bomb was still missing. For nearly 3 months, U.S. Navy ships and divers combed the Mediterranean, guided by submarines and sonar. Locals watched as warships filled their peaceful horizon. Rumors spread that the Americans were fighting an invisible war under the sea. Finally, on April 7, 1966, the missing weapon was located. A fisherman named Francisco Simo spotted an object sinking offshore and guided the Navy to the spot. Using a submersible named Alvin, divers recovered the bomb from a depth of 2,500 feet, battered but intact. When the bomb was lifted onto the deck, sailors stood silently. The weapon that could have destroyed half of southern Spain had been lying in the dark ocean for nearly 3 months. The operation cost more than $80 million, an astronomical sum at the time, and required 27 U.S. ships. But the true cost was not measured in dollars. The soil around Palomares remained contaminated. Thousands of barrels of plutonium-tainted earth were shipped to the United States for disposal. Decades later, radiation levels in some areas still exceeded safety standards. In public, the U.S. Air Force called it a successful recovery. In truth, it was one of the most dangerous nuclear incidents in history. Had any of the bombs detonated, the explosion would have created a radioactive crater visible from space. The Palomares accident revealed what few dared to admit, that the world's most powerful weapons were not only aimed at enemies, they were a constant threat to the very people who built them. Years later, residents of Palomares still remember the day the sky fell. Many suffered health problems that were never officially linked to radiation exposure. The U.S. government quietly paid compensation, but the contamination dispute between Washington and Madrid continued for decades. In 2015, nearly 50 years later, Spain and the United States finally signed a new agreement to clean up what remained of the contaminated soil, proof that the shadow of 1966 had never fully lifted. The Palomares disaster became a lesson in silence, a story buried under diplomacy and secrecy. But among the engineers and the airmen who lived through it, one truth remained. Nuclear weapons didn't need war to be dangerous. They only needed gravity and human error. January 21st, 1968. The Arctic sky was dark, frozen, and silent except for the sound of a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber cutting through the wind. Its mission was routine, part of the ongoing Chrome Dome operation, nuclear-armed bombers constantly patrolling the skies, ready to strike if the Soviets made a move. On board were 4 hydrogen bombs, each one capable of leveling a city. The aircraft had left Plattsburgh, New York, hours earlier and was now flying over Greenland, a NATO territory, under American protection but home to a Danish government that had banned nuclear weapons on its soil. At 11:20 a.m., something went wrong. Inside the cabin, a small piece of foam padding near the navigator's seat caught fire. The crew tried to smother it, but the flames spread fast. Within seconds, smoke filled the cockpit. The temperature rose sharply. Oxygen lines fed the fire like a torch. The B-52 began to lose control. The pilot, Captain John Hogg, ordered the crew to bail out. One by one, they jumped into the freezing void. 6 men survived. 1 did not. Moments later, the aircraft and its nuclear cargo slammed into the ice-covered sea near Thule Air Base. The explosion shattered the silence of the Arctic. The conventional explosives and the bombs detonated on impact, scattering plutonium and uranium across the frozen landscape. The midnight sky over Greenland turned into a deadly glow. Within hours, American rescue teams were dispatched to one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. The mission was, codenamed Crested Ice. What they found was chaos, frozen in time, shattered metal, burning fuel trapped under snow, and radiation spreading with every gust of wind. The priority was clear: recover every fragment of the nuclear weapons before they contaminated the Arctic or fell into Soviet hands. But the temperature was 40 degrees Celsius. Winds reached 100 kilometers per hour. Equipment froze, Geiger counters malfunctioned, and the snow was tainted with invisible death. The recovery operation became one of the most difficult and secretive of the Cold War. Over 700 American and Danish personnel worked day and night in complete isolation. They wore improvised protective suits made from rubber and plastic, often torn by the ice. Frostbite and radiation burns became common. They dug through the frozen debris by hand. Every piece of metal was tested for plutonium traces. The contamination was so severe that large chunks of ice were cut out and sealed in steel barrels for shipment back to the United States. 3 of the 4 nuclear bombs were eventually located, broken, burned, but accounted for. The 4th one was missing. For weeks, U.S. Navy divers scoured the icy waters off Thule. The Danish government demanded answers, but Washington insisted the search was purely precautionary. In truth, one of the weapon's secondary uranium assemblies had vanished beneath the ice. To this day, that missing piece has never been officially recovered. As the months passed, radiation levels in the area began to rise. Danish workers reported chronic health problems, lung cancer, skin lesions, and unexplained illnesses. But their complaints were ignored. Both governments classified the operation and denied any long-term effects. When the cleanup was declared complete, more than 237,000 cubic feet of contaminated ice and debris had been shipped to the U.S. for disposal. Yet traces of plutonium still lingered in the soil for decades. Thule became another forgotten chapter in the history of nuclear accidents, one that almost no one outside the military ever heard about. The crash triggered a diplomatic crisis between Washington and Copenhagen. Denmark had publicly declared itself a nuclear-free zone, yet American bombers had been flying with atomic weapons over its territory for years. The truth came out only after Danish journalists uncovered classified flight records. The revelation led to massive protests, a public outcry, and a re-evaluation of NATO's nuclear policy in Europe. But for the men who had worked on the ice, the ones who had risked everything in the cleanup, there was no recognition. Many died young. Others lived with diseases that were never officially linked to radiation. One survivor, Jen Skrenson, later said, "They told us we were cleaning ice, but we were cleaning death." The Thule disaster wasn't just a technical accident. It was a symbol of a deeper truth, that in the Cold War, secrecy was valued more than safety, and that nuclear deterrence came with invisible victims. By 1968, the United States had lost at least 5 nuclear bombs that were never recovered. Officially, none posed a risk. Unofficially, no one knew where all of them were. The Arctic crash marked the end of Operation Chrome Dome. The Air Force quietly ended the continuous airborne patrols that had kept nuclear weapons in the sky for nearly a decade. But it also marked something else, the beginning of a silence that would last for years. Because what happened at Thule wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a pattern. Accidents hidden from the public, dismissed as minor incidents, erased from official history. And soon, that pattern would repeat again, this time not in the frozen Arctic, but over the coast of California, when a missile armed with a nuclear warhead almost detonated above an American city. In the spring of 1969, America's attention was fixed on the moon. The Apollo program was reaching its peak, promising to land mankind on another world. But back on Earth, in the silence of the California coast, another story was unfolding, one that could have turned the blue skies of the Pacific into fire. At Vandenberg Air Force Base, dozens of Titan II intercontinental ballistic missiles stood ready. Each was armed with a 9-megaton warhead, a bomb 500 times more powerful than Hiroshima. They were America's ultimate deterrent, hidden beneath the ground, locked behind coded doors, waiting for a signal that everyone prayed would never come. On September 19, 1969, technicians were conducting a routine systems check on one of the missiles. These checks happened every week. Pressure levels, fuel stability, guidance, electronics. Nothing unusual. But in the world of nuclear weapons, even the smallest error can rewrite history. At 8:32 a.m., a fuel pressure gauge failed. The technician in charge, Airman Michael Reed, decided to replace it manually. He climbed into the silo wearing a thin protective suit and carrying a wrench, a 10-pound piece of steel. As he loosened the old gauge, the wrench slipped from his hand. It fell 70 feet, bounced off a beam, and punctured the missile's thin fuel tank. Within seconds, a jet of highly explosive oxidizer filled the silo. The smell of acid hit the crew before the alarms even sounded. Everyone scrambled to evacuate, but Reed stayed behind, trying to seal the leak. The oxidizer vapor mixed with the fuel. The temperature climbed, pressure built, and then a boom. The explosion shook the coastline for miles. The 90-ton silo doors were thrown open like paper. The Titan II missile disintegrated. The nuclear warhead, the W-53 device, was blasted clear of the silo, hurled through the air, and landed 200 yards away. For several minutes, no one knew if it had detonated. The shockwave knocked out communications, and first responders were ordered to stay back. The heat from the explosion melted the steel scaffolding. A mushroom-shaped cloud of fuel smoke rose into the morning sky. Inside the control room, officers held their breath, waiting for the impossible, the blinding flash that would mean the end of everything. It never came. When the fires finally died, a recovery team approached the crater. There, half buried in the sand, lay the warhead intact, unexploded, and miraculously safe. Its detonation triggers had failed to arm because a single electrical cable had been severed in the blast. One broken wire had saved California, and perhaps the entire West Coast, from destruction. The Pentagon called it a non-nuclear incident, but among those who were there, the phrase became a bitter joke. The accident was classified for years, the cause hidden under layers of bureaucracy. Airman Reed was killed in the explosion. His name was omitted from official reports. Later, congressional investigations revealed that at least 5 Titan missiles had experienced similar near disasters. Fuel leaks, electrical shorts, fires, all hidden behind the same comforting words, non-nuclear incident. In truth, The Titan II system was a ticking bomb. Its fuel, a volatile mix of nitrogen, tetroxide, and hydrazine, was so unstable that even vibration could ignite it. Yet these missiles stayed active for decades, standing in silos across the American Midwest and West Coast, watched by crews who lived with the constant fear of a single spark. One officer later recalled, "We weren't protecting the country. We were babysitting Armageddon." The California accident was just one of many. Between 1950 and 1980, the U.S. recorded dozens of broken arrow events. Nuclear bombs dropped from planes, warheads lost at sea, missiles that exploded underground. The public never heard about most of them. Each time, the official response was the same: containment, secrecy, denial. But inside the military, fear was spreading. The system was too big, too complex, too human. Engineers called it normalization of deviance, the gradual acceptance of danger as routine. By 1970, the Air Force had started redesigning safety systems, installing new locks, new sensors, new control codes. But for some, it was too late. The damage had been done, not to the nation's defenses, but to its faith in control. The California incident proved what no one wanted to admit, that the greatest nuclear threat to America didn't come from Moscow, but from inside its own borders. The warheads were perfect machines, but the humans who guarded them were not. And as the Cold War continued, those imperfections would surface again, this time in the most unexpected place on Earth, a sleepy Spanish fishing village, where the U.S. would drop 4 hydrogen bombs by mistake. By the late 1970s, the Cold War had reached a strange kind of balance. 2 superpowers, frozen in fear, staring at each other through the crosshairs of annihilation. But beneath that silence, hidden in places the world had forgotten, a new kind of race was unfolding. Not for missiles, not for bombs, for data. After the Thule disaster of 1968, the United States had promised Denmark that it would never again station nuclear weapons on Greenlandic soil. Publicly, that promise stood. Privately, something else was happening. In 1979, American surveillance satellites began detecting strange radiation patterns over the Arctic Circle. Not natural, not atmospheric. The signals matched those of a nuclear detonation, small, controlled, and far from any known test site. The official story blamed solar reflections, but deep within the U.S. Air Force's Strategic Command, analysts had another name for it: shadow test. It began with a theory. After the 1968 crash, the Arctic ice had become contaminated with plutonium fragments that had never been recovered. Over time, those materials could have been collected, or perhaps scavenged. American intelligence believed that fragments from the Thule accident might have been retrieved and secretly studied, not by an enemy nation, but by an American contractor working under extreme secrecy. Satellite imagery showed new construction near the northern coast, small, temporary structures appearing and vanishing within weeks. No public records, no flight logs, only faint heat signatures at night. At the same time, local Inuit hunters reported seeing strange lights over the ice aircraft with no markings, moving in complete silence. One described it simply: the sky glowed for a second, then turned white. The U.S. denied everything. The Danish government knew nothing. But a year later, a classified report leaked from Los Alamos National Laboratory confirmed what had happened. Small-scale nuclear component tests, conducted in the Arctic using remnants from the Thule weapons. The tests weren't detonations, they were data experiments. American engineers were trying to understand what would happen if a nuclear weapon partially detonated on impact, as it had in 1968. They wanted to measure subcritical reaction patterns, the physics of a failed atomic blast. The research was crucial for safety, but it violated treaties, international law, and the sovereignty of an allied nation. When the documents reached Washington, panic set in. The operation was quietly shut down. The records were buried. Officially, the Greenland anomaly never existed, but traces remained. Radiation sensors deployed by Danish scientists years later detected isotopes americium-241, a signature of decayed plutonium, the same isotope found at Thule. In 1995, a declassified Danish parliamentary report confirmed what the U.S. had always denied. Nuclear material had been tested in Greenland long after the Thule accident. The discovery sparked outrage, but by then, everyone involved was dead or retired. No one could explain who authorized it, who conducted it, or why it was kept secret for 2 decades. Too many historians, the shadow test symbolized the darkest side of the nuclear age, the idea that secrecy itself had become more powerful than the weapons it protected. The Arctic had become a silent laboratory, a place where humanity tested its limits against nature and morality alike. And yet, for all the secrecy, one truth stood clear. The nuclear age was no longer about war. It was about control. Control over knowledge, fear, and the illusion that humanity could master what it had created. As the 1980s began, the US and the Soviet Union entered a new phase of escalation. Stealth bombers, MIRV warheads, submarines capable of launching apocalyptic strikes from the deep. But the ghosts of Greenland remained frozen in the ice, glowing faintly beneath the northern lights, a reminder of how close the world had come to losing itself in pursuit of perfection. Because in the nuclear age, danger didn't always explode. Sometimes, it simply stayed buried, waiting. By the dawn of the 1980s, the United States had survived more than 3 decades of living under its own shadow, an empire of weapons, built not just for war, but for deterrence, for fear, for control. But behind the promise of safety lay a haunting reality. The country had come dangerously close to destroying itself more than once. In 1980, that reality returned inside a lonely missile silo near Damascus, Arkansas. The Titan II stood like a silent giant, buried beneath the soil. On the night of September 18th, a maintenance crew entered the silo to perform a routine pressure check. The air smelled faintly of fuel, normal, they thought. The technician carried a socket wrench, heavy and slick with oil, and just like in California, one small mistake changed everything. The wrench slipped, it fell, it punctured the missile's fuel tank. Within seconds, the silo filled with toxic vapor. The crew evacuated, gasping for air, but one officer, Senior Airman David Livingston, refused to leave. He knew what the manuals said. If the missile ignites, there's no escape. At 3 a.m., the unthinkable happened. A spark ignited the vapor, and the silo exploded. Concrete and steel were hurled hundreds of meters into the air. The blast was so powerful that it blew the 9-megaton warhead, one of the most powerful ever built, out of the silo and into a nearby field. When rescue teams arrived, they found the warhead lying intact in the dirt. Its casing scorched, its safety pins still engaged. Once again, pure chance had saved the United States from its own weapon. The Pentagon classified the event as another broken arrow, the 20th on record. The term itself had become a quiet ritual, a way to describe catastrophe without saying the word nuclear. But inside the military, the Damascus incident changed everything. For the first time, Congress held open hearings about America's nuclear safety. The public learned that there had been more than 1,200 nuclear accidents since 1952, 32 of them involving actual weapons. Missiles dropped, bombs lost, cores melted. Systems misread false alarms as Soviet attacks. Each time, humanity had stood on the edge and stepped back, not through genius, but through luck. The Damascus explosion ended the Titan II era. The missiles were decommissioned, the silos sealed, but the nuclear arsenal didn't disappear. It evolved quieter, smaller, more precise, and just as lethal. Today, over 13,000 nuclear weapons still exist in the world. The United States and Russia hold more than 90% of them. They are safer now, at least on paper, but they are still subject to the same flaw that caused every broken arrow before them: human error. Modern nuclear systems are automated, governed by complex codes, AI safeguards, and digital command centers. Yet experts admit that one wrong signal, one cyberattack, one misread radar screen could still unleash Armageddon. The near misses continued, a faulty chip triggering a false alert in 1983. A Norwegian research rocket mistaken for a missile launch in 1995. A software glitch in 2010 that made 50 nuclear missiles go offline at once. Each time, disaster was avoided, but each time It reminded the world that control was only an illusion. The nuclear age was never about power. It was about balance. A fragile balance between machines and men, between secrecy and truth, between arrogance and survival. Every accident, every hidden explosion, every non-nuclear incident told the same story. Humanity had built something it could barely understand, and now it was trying to live with it. For the survivors of Goldsboro, Palomares, Thule, and Damascus, the memory never left. They had seen the edge, the moment where the world could have ended not by war, but by a wrench, a spark, or a pilot's error. Their stories remain buried in declassified documents, government archives, and whispered memories of men who swore never to speak. But the truth endures. The most dangerous moments in nuclear history didn't happen between enemies. They happened between allies, between machines, between seconds of human imperfection. And so, the final broken arrow isn't a single event. It's the moment we stop believing it can happen again. Because as long as these weapons exist, as long as they wait in their silos and submarines, the next accident is not a question of if, it's only a question of when.